Hi, this is Nick Lalonde, your host of What's Next, making your third act your best act. Today you're going to hear from Mike Chica. Mike was an executive at a large corporation and was handed a buyout opportunity nearly 2 years ago. After mulling it over, he decided to take it. Despite financially having enough to completely step away from work, he decided at the age of 58 that he was going to decelerate from the workforce slowly by transitioning into part-time consulting work. What stuck out to me in my conversation with Mike is how at this stage in life, his family is his number one purpose, and he needed his work to complement that. While Mike values autonomy, he always wants to be adding value in some way. Be sure to listen in when Mike talks about his father-in-law and how he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in his community. I hope that you'll enjoy my conversation with Mike as much as I did. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining today's episode of What's Next, making your third act your best act. Today I'm super excited. We have a special guest on the show, Mike Chica. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on to the show. So Mike, I was really excited to have you. I know that you've recently made a transition in the last couple of years of your life. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing before and what you're doing today?
Absolutely. So I spent a long time working as an executive for a very large financial services organization, and I held roles both in customer contact operations and the formal information technology organization, and all of that was very focused on customer interactions or the customer contact center, both operationally to support that and the technology that allows the operations to do a really good job for the customer. And so currently I've transitioned where I'm doing just some part-time consulting still in and around that space. So a lot of the engagements that I have been doing in a part-time fashion have still been focused on, customer operations, the technology that supports that, and really staying current with all of the different solutions that are available.
What prompted you to make this transition?
So at a high level, I was looking for a change. I had an opportunity to accept a package from my prior employer, and I accepted that package a couple of years ago. And what it really offered me is a couple of things. I was looking for something different than, a traditional large company role that I had been doing for over 25 years. And the second thing is I really needed to kind of dial back, or I wanted to dial back my level of uh, of engagement and the amount of time I would spend working formally. And there were a couple of different things striving at that. One is I really had very strong demands on the family side of the equation. So aging parents and the need to help care and support them and balancing through loss and helping them remain independent and autonomous. And as I reflect back on that, I don't know how I would have maintained my prior full-time schedule and also been able to successfully balance that with the needs of my family.
It sounds like this transition, unbeknownst to you, happened at a really good time because you're able to be there for family. And so in this transition, going from big corporate America to maybe more on a consulting basis that you're working, you have a lot more autonomy maybe on the projects that you're taking on, maybe less travel. So how you get to work, maybe in some cases it's more virtual. And then maybe the amount of time, so the amount of hours that you're spending on a weekly basis. Is that right?
Yeah, all that's true. And I will say that the family demands were maybe starting to emerge at the time, but they weren't really the primary driver at that particular moment. But it turned out very quickly to be fortuitous that I made the change at the time that I did.
Wow. As you look back on it, I mean, has this been a tough process? Has it been a good process? I mean, it's been about 2 years now.
It's overall, I would describe it as different, right? So has it been tough at times? But it's a different kind of tough and challenge. When you need to transition from working in a very structured corporate environment for a large company, that type of work is very, very different than what you need to do to help support family. and help them get through loss and help them to be independent when maybe they weren't the ones doing certain aspects of, financial. And it's been rewarding in that sense because it's helped make a difference for family. For my wife specifically as it relates to her side, and for my own mother as well.
So I'm hearing more and more folks between 55 and 65 are being offered packages from their company, right? Big corporate companies, kind of like yourself. And a lot of them dream of going this consulting route. How would you prepare someone in that age range for making this transition like you did?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I would do is I would suggest that you have conversations, lean on colleagues, talk to people who've made the transition, find out what they like about it, find out what they don't like about it, find out what's worked well for them. What would they do differently if they were starting that over again, just to really try to get a taste for it before you get there. So you can properly set your expectations, know what you're going to be getting into, and try to limit the number of surprises that could come from making a change like that. And then I would also say, and this is more general advice than it is specific to consulting, but have a plan B. If this isn't turning out the way that you want it to, have a plan B for maybe how you'll try to re-enter the more traditional workforce, or find something else that you want to give of yourself in the overall equation.
And Mike, you're 60 years old today, is that right?
I am. Yep.
So you made this decision at 58.
Yep.
So when you retire early, that can be really expensive because you may miss out on compounding growth from 58 to, let's say, your mid 60s. You don't have Social Security. You don't have health insurance, right? So you don't have Medicare yet. How did you know that you had enough? I mean, what kind of work did you do, or what kind of conversations did you have to know that you could make this transition, and if it didn't work out, you would be okay?
Yeah, and so I had spent quite a bit of time, probably starting in my late 40s, early 50s, investing a lot of time in my own financial picture and my family's financial picture. So I had a good understanding, and you don't know what the future holds, right? But you can do some work in and around. Hey, here's what I can do. Here's what the options are available to me in terms of bridging to Medicare, for example, or bridging to Social Security, and where's a source of income going to come from? And so, part-time consulting offers something in that regard. I was retirement eligible at my organization, so that offered some benefits in terms of stock that I had been granted over time. 100% investing in 401k and pension plans, and also some retiree benefits in and around healthcare and dental insurance and things of that nature. So that was part of the equation in understanding, is it the right time, and am I going to be able to do it?
And did you have clients right away as you made this transition, or did they just kind of find you? I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, a little bit of both, because it's not like, at least in my specific example, it wasn't like one day I'm working for a large company and the next day I'm gone. So you understand, kind of the trajectory that things are on. So I started conversations with colleagues and companies prior to. And
Hmm.
then really in earnest, once I left my prior employer, really in earnest, focusing on, not everything is an engagement where you're getting paid to be a consultant, but sometimes there's a lot of discovery work. You're having a lot of conversations in and around the type of work available, the type of projects that are available, what you want to work on. If you're willing to travel, are you willing to come on full time? Things of that nature.
Hmm. Hmm. Are you working today because you need to financially, or are you working today because of other reasons?
Yeah, I'd say financially is not the primary driver. A little bit of income never hurts, right? But I'm primarily continuing because, as you mentioned earlier, I made my change and decision when I was at 58. That's not bumping up against, when I want to start drawing on Social Security. It's not bumping up against Medicare, but understanding a financial plan. I was more looking for a change. And what I discovered is after I made my change, the timing couldn't have been better because of other demands on on my time that were emerging at the time I made the decision, but not the most prominent driver of why I wanted to make a change. And at a high level, it's really just family demands associated with, loss, aging parents, and how we can help best support them in their. And if this is the third act, maybe that's the fourth act for their life.
It's so interesting because I talk to some retirees and some love retirement, but some of the high achievers I speak to that step away from their work, they're not really enjoying it. And they're not finding as much satisfaction as they thought from traveling around the world, playing pickleball, waking up late. And what I often hear is missing is a sense of purpose, mental stimulation, camaraderie. So engaging with other people on teams that they worked on or companies they managed. Do you feel like consulting is providing you some of those things? Do you think that's why you actually do the consulting work?
Yeah, I'd say that's a degree of it. And then, all the things that you mentioned can come from different sources, right? So, I'm getting some stimulation from the things I can do to help support my mother-in-law, the things I can do to help support my own mother, my own family needs. We've got another generation in our family. I'm a grandfather, 2 times over. So we spend a lot of time with family, and it is different. And that's one of the things you brought up earlier is, be realistic, understand how things are going to change, talk to people, find out what's worked for them. Your situation might be very different, but understanding and having the right expectations can be a little bit of a fighting back on, hey, I'm not getting what I used to be getting because, well, A, should you have expected that? And, B, what were you doing to try to have a plan to move through that change at the time? And it's not perfect. It wasn't all, butterflies in the meadow and things of that nature because it is a change. And I even had to orient myself to the change of focusing so much time on extended family. I have 3 children of my own, so there's always been a lot as it relates to my immediate family, but really wrapping your head around the best way you can help support, aging parents and extended family. That was a significant change for me as well.
So I'm curious, there's three acts of life. Your first act is all about learning. So oftentimes, let's say it's 0 to 30 years old, maybe you're starting out in a profession, you're being mentored. Your second act of life, I'd say, is typically 30 to 60 years old. And these are people who are growing, accumulating, building. Maybe they're working up the corporate ladder, they're building businesses. So for you, right, moving into that executive leadership. Um, and then really the third act of life is finding fresh purpose and identity. And so I'm curious for you, do you identify, like, while you're still working today, you're still doing consulting, do you identify more with the third act of life or do you identify more with the second act of life and why?
I would say both, right? So I'm kind of on the cusp of the way you tranched out those categories, right? So I'm on the very tail end of that accumulation phase and kind of moving into third act if I don't already have one foot there, right? And so for me it's a little bit of balancing, and that brings up another thing you asked about a little bit earlier is if you can, you don't have to make sudden change, right? Can you keep some of what you had for, a period of decades and start transitioning versus, more of a sudden change? And that goes back to having a plan, some expectations, and if that opportunity is available for you. But, as it relates to having that sense of purpose, my thought has been, I've always drawn inspiration from my family. But as it relates to third act, I draw inspiration specifically as it relates to the third act and retirement from my late father-in-law, because he worked probably up until he was 64, 65 in a more formal employment engagement. And then he immediately went to work giving back to his community. And so he spent time fundraising for a variety of different things in the community, local food shelves, local athletic programs, and anything that the community needed. And he literally, over a period of about 15 plus years, he had a Hall of Fame second career as it related to giving back to the community. And I literally mean Hall of Fame because recently he was inducted into the Community Giving Hall of Fame for his community, everything he gave. So I've got a great example that was set for me.
Yeah, we should all try to be like your dad, right?
Yeah, it's my father-in-law, but yes, absolutely. If
That is
everybody gave even a fraction of what he gave, my goodness, what we'd have on our hands in terms of, community growth and development.
that is so incredible. I want to go back to something you mentioned though. You talked about slowly moving out of maybe the workforce rather than cold turkey. And I'm seeing this more and more with high achievers. So I just talked to a guy last week. He sold a business and he's chosen to stay on as a consultant for this business for a number of years. He said, Nick, I didn't want the stress that came of running a business day to day. I was on call for my job, really as the business owner on a weekly basis. But he said, now that I've switched to more of this consulting path, it's low stress, right? I have more autonomy to do the things I want to do. And so this is his path too. I mean, he was going
Yeah,
100 miles per hour, and he's
right.
maybe going 20 or 30 miles per hour, and his goal is to maybe hang it up in the next couple of years. Do you recommend that type of path to other high achievers that you're speaking with that are thinking about getting out of corporate America, maybe in executive leadership or maybe business owners? Do you think that would be a better path than just going cold turkey?
I do, but I also acknowledge that it's not a one size fits all proposition, and it may not
Mm-hmm.
be for some people. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, Nick, but in my case, when I had accepted the package, I also didn't leave right away. After deciding to accept the package, I had a colleague reach out to me and offer me an opportunity to come back and work on a contract for 6 months. Well, 6 months turned into a year before I actually formally left my prior employer and effectively made my change. So I would say the short answer to your question is yes, with the qualification of that's not right for everybody. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there are drivers and primers for change that are going to be more immediate, and you make that decision and you move on.
Did you have any colleagues that were maybe similar to where you were on the corporate ladder that took the package and maybe said, "Hey, we're
Absolutely.
we're just retiring completely. We're not going to do the consulting or anything beyond this."
Yeah, there were examples of that in my immediate work group. There were more a handful of people in a situation like mine. Yeah, working for a long time, maybe not ready to immediately retire, but it's in the later innings, I would say, since it's baseball season. And they probably have another thing that they want to go do, whether it's, hey, I will, step to another organization and work for a period of time, or yes, other examples where consulting was the route for them as well.
Yeah. And how did it go for some of these people?
Yeah, the ones I've stayed in contact with, it went very well. I've had one or two where they had an initial plan to hop to another organization or start doing some consulting, and after about a year and a half, they decided to fully retire. And they've got their own plan for purpose and activity and things like that. But they had a taste of doing something a little bit different, and it bridged some of the time for them. Some of them a little older than me, and some of them a little younger than me.
So when you see these people who are fully retired today, what are they doing with their time?
Yeah, a lot of them are, traveling a lot. You mentioned pickleball. I mean, honestly, I haven't gotten out there yet, but if I had a finger and a toe for every time I'd been asked, there is, it's, I think the beneficial thing, at least for my former colleagues, is they saw this coming and or they made the decision themselves, and there's something to be said for being in control of your own direction and destiny. It doesn't mean it's going to work out the best, but at least from a starting point, if you see it coming, you can have a plan, and you fit to a degree, you figure out some of it as you go. And I know that's not what this conversation is about, but I think being flexible, and I mentioned earlier having a plan B,
Mhm.
it helps, because if you're confronted with a certain set of circumstances and you already know what you need to go do, that's different than figuring out once you're confronted with that set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the second and the third act conversation. So you had mentioned, Nick, I'm still maybe in between those two. I maybe have a foot in the third act. So when will you completely have 2 feet in your third act?
Yeah, I would say, at a high level, at least my plan as it stands now, is that could be as soon as 2 years or less, or it could be as long as 10 years, just depending on what I'm doing, how much I'm enjoying it, the demands and needs and desires of my family. Those are the factors I'll consider as I move along.
Do you think that your third act has the potential to be your best act of life?
I'd say I'm hopeful for that, and I think some of that is how you define best, right? I want to be healthy enough to do the things I want. My wife and I really enjoy traveling, and so I want to do a lot of that. But I don't think, at least for most people, and not in my situation, am I going to be traveling full time. But I think it has the potential. But like anything else, have a passion, have a purpose. Have some inspiration in and around what you'd like to accomplish. And the third act is often is defined as enjoying yourself. Well, where do you derive that enjoyment from? Because as you said earlier, I don't think you necessarily are going to get that kind of enjoyment from I wake up late, I do whatever I want to do every day, and I travel because that's probably not going to fill up the day.
What do you think will fill up your day? What do you think is going to give you the chance of having your best third act of life?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is, I even when I'm not consulting part time, I want to be doing something at least part time. If you've got a demand on your day, whether it's independent and discretionary or something more formally scheduled, I think it'll all come together quite well. And again, God willing, and having health and all of those sorts of things. If I'm not consulting, I still want to have part of my day spoken for. And like I mentioned, the inspiration of my father-in-law, I have a pretty strong lean towards how I will give to organizations, in need, nonprofits, the community, things of that nature. But it'll be structured enough where I'll be doing it, multiple days a week.
Are there some organizations you're really passionate about today?
Yeah, I have my I have twin sons, and they were born very prematurely, so they were in the hospital for the first 2 years of their life. They're doing great, by the way. But children's organizations, children's hospitals, things of that nature. I've had family members afflicted with cancer, so the American Cancer Society and some of those organizations, and then my wife and I are dog lovers, so I have a soft spot in my heart for animals as well.
And how are you volunteering with these organizations? Is it financially? Is it with maybe the skill set that you've created over your career, or is it more just like the physical labor where you show up and you say, "Hey, put me to work"?
Yeah. I'd say currently it's more of I show up and I contribute how I can, and then, financially contributing as well. But I expect that to evolve into, some application of a skill set that I think I can offer to bring value to the organization as well.
Hmm. Could you see yourself leveraging any of your skill set from your career?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Whether that's, there's a lot of transferable skills that you get when you work in a large organization or any organization for that matter. And I think probably the best one is just in and around, um, learning how to engage and interact with people. And there's a lot of analogies between a work environment to family to nonprofit organizations, and so that's the first one that's top of mind for me.
You know what's so interesting, and just from having had a ton of conversations with people about their third act of life, is I think the people who are unhappy oftentimes in their third act, they go into it thinking this is all about fun, right? And play and enjoyment. And they don't think that there's any work to maybe be had in the third act of life in some cases. And what I liked that you mentioned earlier is you said, Nick, if it's not consulting, and it may not be consulting 2 to 10 years from now, I want my week spoken for still. So I want to be doing other activities. I want to have things on my calendar. So it sounds like, I mean, you could be 75, for instance, and almost have a part time job and not really a job, but be working part time in some of these organizations you just mentioned, right? Where
Right.
you're
And
volunteering your time.
absolutely. I mean, in my father-in-law's example, he was doing this literally up until the time he went into the hospital, and ultimately passed. So he was in his early 80s, still very active in helping support the community. And not all of it's fun, right? You write down all the things that you really enjoy. It's not fun doing, some of the family things that need to be addressed. It's not fun, doing certain jobs that organizations need in order to be successful, but that's part of where you give of yourself and you add value.
When you mentioned you're hopeful that your third act could be your best act, it sounds like some of that was depending on your health. So if your health allowed for you to really enjoy this third act of life, what would it take for you to really have a healthy third act of life, you think?
Yeah, I think, being able to give of myself, both to my family, not having limits or restrictions around that, being able to, you know, um, make contributions to organizations that are in need, being able to effectively give, and not having limitations in and around that. And I mentioned health primarily because it's just not predictable, right? And, as we age, the chances for things to impact our day-to-day lives go up. And so I've just seen it, examples of it with, friends and colleagues my age, and also with aging family members as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been really good, Mike. I'm excited to see as you transition full time into your third act over the next 2 to 10 years, how it goes for you. I think you have a really good foundation where the focus is on family. It's going to be on cycling from work to play. You said, Nick, I really enjoyed travel, but I want to make sure my week is spoken for. One of the greatest predictors of longevity is community and it's social interactions. And so it sounds like you're going to be getting a lot of social interaction in your day to day, and is one of the reasons why you do consulting. One last question I have for you before we wrap up
Sure.
is, when you look back on your career, is there, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would have done differently?
I don't know if I can say it with all out certainty, Nick, but I've worked a long time. I've had jobs since I was 14, but after exiting college, I really had two companies that I worked for. I worked for one of them for almost 13 years, and I worked for another one for almost 27 years. In retrospect, as I reflect, I may have gotten a little more experience outside of those two organizations. And I don't know whether that would have worked out better for me or not, because when you work for companies for a long time, yes, it's the same company. But at least in my example, these companies were made over multiple times in the time I was there. And so very different than the company I joined, worked for halfway through, and the nature of the company when I was there. But I may have gotten a little broader experience and exposure than I did working for two companies over the span of over 35 years.
Wow, well said. Sounds like maybe hop in to more companies along the way rather than two companies, even though they've changed several times over
Yeah,
while
and
you've been there.
there were opportunities many times over the years, but some of those carried with them, it wasn't the virtual environment that it is now. We want you to relocate, and there were opportunities all along the way there, and I don't know how much hopping I would have done, but instead of two companies, maybe somewhere in the 3 to 5 range, and it just rounds things out, gives you different exposure because, like I said, I still think I got some of that over the course of the decades with companies, because they were made over multiple times during that stretch.
Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was great
Of
having
course.
you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you, Nick.
Take care.